Friends and enemies, welcome back. Different configuration in the studio tonight after tonight, and actually before we started too. The studio's configured for a 3-man weave live tomorrow. Brad Mills and Ali Hammam are coming by, weather permitting. We're snowed in right now pretty good here in Dundas, so we'll see. But tonight we have Keith, Dicker, Rich Diaz and Dicker. Probably the most two prominent Canadian Ds courting a mostly male audience since Pam Anderson. And they have a lot to say about the Canadian economy. We're going to talk about Mark Carney. We're going to talk about energy. We're going to talk about the Loonie, all these things. But for the normal listeners, you'll know that the ads are usually a little longer than this. But if you're listening for the first time, I'm going to blast through these since we're under a bit of a time crunch. Easy DNS. Mark has been a friend of the show, friend of the podcast, friend of mine for a long time. Use his service if you're starting a website, starting a business. Go there, use our promo code, Canadian Bitcoiners or CBP Media, something like that. You get 50% off. I know you guys are using it. Keep doing it. There'll be a link in the show description. You can't go wrong. He'll give you your money back if you don't like the service. Won't happen. Never happens, but I'm saying it anyway. And then Bull Bitcoin, best place to buy Bitcoin in Canada. You can sell it there too, though you shouldn't. You can pay your bills there with Bitcoin, though you shouldn't, or maybe you should. I don't know. And don't forget, non-custodial, never get rugged. Okay. Krista Freeland wants to freeze your bank account. Can't freeze your Bull account. Can't freeze your hardware wallet. Don't worry about that. Use the promo code. You get $20 or $21. I forget how much. Doesn't matter, because you guys should all be signed up. Okay, here we go. Keith Dicker, Rich Diaz, IceCap Management, IceCap Global, IceCap something. What's going on, boys? Long time. Rich, little less time than Keith and I, but it's good to have you both back.
Thank you. I guess I'm smarter. We never know who to go first. It's actually this. We have the same problem on the Loonie Hour. Sometimes Keith jumps in, other times I jump in. But anyway, thank you for having us back, Joey. It's nice to be back. Nice to chat with you. And yeah, thanks for having us.
So I'm excited to meet everyone in the community here tonight. I just happen to think the visibility for the world, the economy, financial markets, social movements, I think it's crystal clear where everything is going. Some people might really like where we're going. Other people may not like it. Other people might have their the three monkeys. What is it? See no evil, hear no evil, and what's the other one?
Speak no evil. Yeah.
Speak, not eat. Speak.
I think it's speak.
Anyway, I just we're on the Loonie Hour podcast we do. I'm super excited about that. And for IceCap, how we're managing portfolios, we have a lot of enthusiasm, and maybe for some insensitive reasons, maybe. But I think everyone should be prepared for some great opportunities coming up here. I just think I'm pretty excited about it.
That's a good way to put it. And we'll hit the ground running here. There's, in my mind, a couple of significant moving parts, especially for financial markets. I would say culturally too, but we may or may not touch that tonight. The first thing, and the thing that's on everyone's mind, we talk about it on our program, our chat talks about it, everyone on the news is talking about it, and you guys on Loonie Hour are talking about it as well, the Trump effect. And this guy is a steamroller like no one else. Someone compared him the other day. I thought this was a very apt analogy. A man who's coming into Lighthouse for the second time, he's like a guy who dies in a video game, but gets put back with a full set of lives right before the final boss of the level. And it seems to me like this is the way this guy is carrying himself now. He understands how to win. He understands who's on his team. He understands the strengths on his side and the weaknesses on the other. And it's showing. So I think maybe let's start with him. Rich, you put out a video. You put out videos every week for IceCap, but you put out a video the other day or maybe a week or two ago about how Canada as the 51st state is absurd, doesn't make sense. We are not the 51st state. I think a lot of our listeners here would argue that culturally we're basically already there in a lot of ways. And economically, we may be closer than maybe the mainstream realizes. I'm not sure where I come down on those things. I do know that if there was ever an offer to give me my retirement accounts in US dollars at parity, I would jump ship. I think a lot of people who are under 35 and net producers who still can't afford homes in the big cities, which is to say places where there's opportunities and jobs, they would probably jump ship too. But maybe you guys have a different view, and I'd be curious to hear, what is your stance on this whole 51st state thing? Is it possible that this is actually something that could come to fruition?
Keith, why don't you go ahead and then I'll finish up.
Okay. I'd be very quick and blunt about it. I think it's ridiculous. It's a great narrative. But to actually have Canada join the US, just the process involved with it would never work unless there's some kind of abrupt change happening in the world. Can Canada break up? Yeah, absolutely. But I think right now, for some reason, Canadians are all banding together. You know, they're all very emotional and adamant about something where that's not as important, whereas they should have been more. They should have better feelings about something else leading into it. So no, Joey, I don't think this is happening. Rich might disagree with me, but I don't think that's where Canada
No,
is headed.
I think it's just like, why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? And so that's the way I would put it. I mean, you mentioned my video. That's the Ice Cap Canadian Market Wrap, and we talk about this. And I had to address it because I think you're right. There are some real cultural links that I think are really important. I think people don't realize how integrated our economies are, for better and for worse. And I mean across the board, whether it's a regulatory, whether it's spectrum, whether it's telecommunications. Obviously, we share airspace. It's an unguarded border. I mean, there's police like leaving aside the drugs. There's obviously some policy that like some joint policy initiatives on crime and terrorism. There's NORAD, NATO. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But the reality is I think it's mostly a red herring, and it has been from the start. I think it's a narrative that our media, I think, latched onto because they're just desperate to sort of distract from the Liberals' economic record. It's an easy sort of, Trump is just something that's easy to hate in Canada, for better or for worse. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, just that's the reality of it. Whereas the truth is that our economies are inextricably linked. And the most obvious place that we're linked is in the energy sector, where we send 97% of our barrels to the United States via pipeline and on rail. They refine it, they send it back to us, and or they export it or they use it or whatever. And they can't really live without us from an energy perspective, although they could probably live without us from other product perspective. And we certainly cannot live without them. And so I think really it's all this chatter distracts from really what I think is the issue, which is the drugs, which is China and rare earth minerals and the Arctic. And I think whether you listen to Trump, if you have to sort of, I think that's the signal. And Trump, I think that all this jibber jabber about the 51st state is the noise.
What do you make of the prime minister saying that it's not noise at that recent media event, right? Maybe he's just lost in the sauce too? I don't know. Keith is laughing. I think that might actually be the case, but I don't know.
No, I think it's just a great opportunity for them. I think what we often do is we forget to put ourselves in the shoes of our, not enemies, that's too strong, but let's say our political opponents or ideological opponents. We forget, like, this gentleman was getting literally the most historically unloved or hated prime minister in the history of Canada. They were talking about the Bloc Québécois, the separatist party of Quebec, being the official opposition just a couple months ago. And in a way, Trump gave the Liberal Party a gift. And the gift is something for all of us to rally around and hate. Again, right or wrong, that's just sort of the reality of it. And I think the Liberal Party, I think we should not mistake someone who we don't like for being an idiot or not being a shrewd politician. I think Justin Trudeau is a very shrewd politician. And he took this opportunity and ran with it. He took the football and he's desperate to get into the end zone, which is this idea that Trump is bad, Canada good, and this is something that we can just use to distract against his horrible economic record. I don't know what Keith has to think, but that's my view.
That's actually pretty. I should have wrote some of this down, Rich. You're making some great.
It happens every once in a while.
Joey, what do you think? Like, what do you see from your side?
For me, I think there's got to be a clear definition of what it means to become the 51st state. I think Rich is describing conflicting situations. Sorry, Rich. I think when I hear you say that we can't live without Canada's energy, or he can't live without Canada's energy over there, I also hear you say that, they could survive without us and we couldn't survive without them. That's a parasitic relationship. And, whether or not it means the complete sort of balkanization of Canada internally or the annexation of Canada to the States, I don't think it makes a difference. I think materially, maybe not from the subject, maybe not from the perspective of like, new borders on a map or, me being able to cast a vote in an American election. I think we're a lot closer, and it sounds like you guys do too, economically, to being this sort of American parasite than we are being our own independent nation. That's our own fault. And when I think about what might come in the next year or two and what might not come in the next year or two, I think it's important to talk about Quebec a little bit, because Quebec is this sort of interesting microcosm of people, hardy people. I love the Quebecois. Bull Bitcoin, the sponsor of the show, is all Quebecois. They're fantastic guys. But to hear the Quebec premier talk about how, or excuse me, the bloc leader, what's his face? Sorry, I forget his name.
Blanchet.
Talk about how they won't allow a pipeline at a time when Canada, maybe for the first time in a decade, 2 decades, is united behind that sort of initiative, thanks to the threat from the US, is difficult for me to stomach. And then when I think about the equalization payments that Quebec gets, I think to myself, like, that's a nice first piece of the puzzle to chip away at if you're the United States. And then after that, you chip away at Alberta vis-a-vis the energy card. And then once you lose those 2 states, those two provinces, again, maybe not in terms of like voting rights or border redraws, but pragmatically, you're a different country after that. And a lot of people start to lose their attachment to Canada. Now, don't forget, our prime minister, shrewd as he may be, spent the better part of a decade demanding flags fly at half staff all over the country, and now wants to unite people under a culture he said didn't exist and was worthy of being burned. And so when I hear this idea that we're going to unite, I think that's a flimsy set of ideals for a people that are apathetic in the best interpretation and just don't have time because they're spending it all on putting food on the table in the worst. And so I think we're a lot closer to this absorption, culturally, economically, whatever, than maybe the experts on the call think. Now, I'm just a guy in his basement. You guys are the ones managing money. Tell me where I'm wrong on that.
First of all, I would not use the word shrewd to describe the current prime minister. So let's get that off the table here. So let me tell everyone what's really happening here, so we don't get lost in a lot of the noise that's out there. And Rich and I, we talk about this all the time. We talk about it with our clients all the time, and leading into this, I say, hey, there's lots of great opportunities coming up and stuff. Everything the world has experienced over the previous 40 years, that's not going to happen again. So to expect a linear outcome from what we've already done, it's wrong. So thinking, Quebec will fight with Alberta and Ottawa will be conservatives and liberals back and forth. That's all done. That's not going to happen. Same thing for the Americans, Europeans, and Chinese, and so forth. But we've just completed this 40-year cycle with long-term rates always going lower, governments always able to fund their deficits because rates were always lower, and growth was always a little bit higher than what it cost of funding. Now we hit zero rates, overnight rates in 2009, and then they use zero rates, near zero, and QE to flatten the global yield curve for over a decade. When you have 40 years, Joey, of rates always going lower, a lot of great things can happen. And then there's lots of noise going on, parties bickering about this and that. You had globalization take place. China and India both enter the WTO. Rich laughs when I say this, but the internet was created. And, a lot of things were happening that gave everyone the opportunity to pick a lot of very low-hanging fruit. All that fruit's now been picked. It's gone. And to try to reach higher to get it, you have to pay higher for your funding costs. There's no government out there on the planet right now that's able to fund their deficit. And what they forecast a year ago is now blown out of the water. You know what the Canadian story is. What's the Canadian story in deficit, Rich? They haven't even told us yet. I mean, they're sort of guessing at it. But the point I'm making is that the world has now shifted away from this globalist kind of agenda. And that's what Mark Carney represents, by the way. I'm not a fan of his policies. He's a very nice gentleman, but what he represents, that's the previous 40 years. Instead, the Americans had grabbed everything by the horns here. And they're saying, hey, we are now going to turn towards a domestic focused policy. We're going to cut rates. We're going to try to become more efficient with the government spending. We're going to reduce administration and red tape and stuff like that. Lower taxes story is happening as well. And we're going to focus on energy and technology, and we're going to suck in foreign capital from everyone else around the world. As that's happening, the rest of the world, we now have a choice, including here in Canada. We can say, we're going to do the same thing, or we're going to boo the American national anthem. We're going to raise our own tariffs, and we're going to, fight climate and all this stuff. And if that happens, Canadian dollar is going sub 50. I mean, we can't help it, but we'll make money on it. But I just happen to think we're going to have a completely different experience coming up from we had previously. And people who can see that, I just think it's an amazing opportunity lining up right now.
So in your view, and we'll bring Rich back in as well, is the fix to this some level or some degree of like a commodity nationalism of sorts? Sort of you're protecting your energy, protecting your commodity stash, and then also supporting your currency and not thinking about trade first, as opposed to the past 40 years where, like you mentioned, it was global, everything was everyone's, and we're all sharing and doing all this stuff. Does Canada have that capacity? If so, and if not, then what is the fix for the CAD and maybe for the Canadian economy writ large?
Yeah, so the quick answer is yes to the first part of the question. The next part of the question is right as of today, Canada is not going down that road. So I think we have an amazing opportunity in Canada if we focus on our natural resource sector. And there's a few things we can do to quickly resolve our debt problems and so forth. The future can be incredibly bright for Canada. I think there's a 10% chance we go that route. And it's simply because the political establishment or the blob or whatever you want to call it, it's just not set up to do it. So therefore, the opposite has to happen. So, I think there's a load of money to be made here in the currency world. What were your thoughts, Rich, on those lines?
I mean, there's lots of stuff to unpack there. I stress that this is not about Canada and the U.S. This is about China. And I would just submit that listening. I know I'm shifting gears here a little bit, but I think we need to sort of take Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State, at face value. And this idea that we're parasitic, I don't agree with that at all. I think we are a trading economy. I think loads of people, I think the idea that countries should be completely self-sufficient, I think is not only against what Adam Smith would argue, which is we should exploit our competitive advantages to the betterment of humanity through free markets, but I think is wildly sort of dislocated from the reality of our geography. We cannot grow oranges in Canada. We need to import them from Florida. And, that's a sort of an example of many, many different situations across all different products and services. And we should import them and export our products and services that we have in abundance, which is the energy piece. So, like, can we recalibrate ourselves? Can Quebec become more productive? Absolutely. But to address that equalization payments thing, I think it's quick. It's amazing how quickly we forget in 2014 when Alberta was hemorrhaging money and jobs. No one bitched about equalization payments then. And so I think what my point is that in each, I think the idea that what I agree with you in the sense that Blanchet shouldn't have said that, but Blanchet is not the leader of Quebec, right? He is a federal MP. Whereas if you look at Legault, who is the PM of Quebec and will ultimately be the arbiter of any pipeline, he's much more amenable to that. Because, as you said, the Canadian population, I think 74% of Quebecers said that we want pipelines. And so I think that, it's important that we sort of focus on what I think is the signal and not the noise. And that's why I bring it back, just to finish up, I bring it back to China. This is not about US versus Canada. This is US versus China. And like Keith mentioned, that the world is different. And going forward, that the world will be different. And I think that we need to look at both asset allocation, portfolio construction, currency, the politics, how countries manage themselves and invest through the lens of this new paradigm, which is China versus the US. And I think everything sort of falls in line from that.
Yeah, I do like that framing. I wish I knew more about the China angle, because that's a, sort of famously difficult country to read and get information from, whether it's economic data or otherwise. I'm curious, maybe before we move on, what other, what opportunities should we not be squandering as a population while we have this sort of feeling of unity, temporary as it may be, fleeting as it may be? This very rare, outside of like cheering for the Canadian Olympic hockey team, that we have people all wearing the same jersey in this country. And, we seem to have it right now. What should we be doing as a nation, given this level of support? It seems like broad support for Canada first.
I'll go first on this one. First of all, Joey, there's no unity. Come on. So, I mean, the classic strategy for every single country, government, empire since history was created. When you have a domestic problem or challenge of crisis, you have to find an external enemy to direct everyone's attention to. That's what you always do. So all of a sudden, Rich mentioned a few moments ago, the Liberals were polling pretty low. Were they like low single digits?
No, they were like, low teens.
Yeah.
Low
I mean, like
teens.
1 seat, maybe 2 seats were coming up.
It was like 10,
And-
I'm pretty sure. 10 was like the floor I saw last I checked.
Yeah, that's just generous. And then they received this gift, and they were able to direct their energy towards the one person on the planet that everyone has very strong feelings about. Some are positive and some are negative. And Canadians, they band together. Of course, we're with that. And then all of a sudden, I mean, and there's some pretty good data floating around, and I think it's a National Bank data point, Rich. It shows that the equivalent cost of provincial tariffs between each other,
IMF data. Sorry.
Yeah, it's about 21%. So a little bit lower than this, this mythical 25% data. And you bring that point up, and it's crickets. No, we're not willing to help Canadians with that. So I don't think there's any unity across the country whatsoever. This will blow over in terms of this, strong emotional support or non-support for one thing over another. And Canada's no different than any other country. We're always going to do what's best. So put it this way, like this is my view. Like I have strong political views, but I'm apolitical. Like I don't support one side over the other. But both sides, they have very good traits or features about themselves, and some that are not very positive as well. You can never get the best of both worlds, of course. But we have that happening. But every other country is the same way. And the one country that we're watching right now, and this could cause the whole world just to go. We have Germany coming up in a couple of weeks, their election.
Yep.
And it is going to create noise, but it should not create the outcome that the EU does not want. But if for some reason it did, you had this and by the way, I'm referring to the German election where the call it
AFD.
the non-mainstream, the AFD, the alternative for Deutschmark or Deutschland, I guess it is. If their support is actually a lot higher, that's polled. It's similar to what happened with Brexit in 2016 and with Trump as well. The entire EU disintegrates. Like it is literally over the next day. And I use that as an example because here in Canada, we have the same kind of things going on. The Americans just went through it and they had this overwhelming, swing. So again, the world is always going to continue and go on, but we're going to move into something that's very different. And from this insensitive financial perspective, because that's what Rich and I do, we manage money for families right across Canada, and we need to be insensitive. This is going to create a lot of severely moving markets up and down. And if you're positioned correctly, Joey, I think this is just an amazing time. So can myself and Rich and you, Joey, can we change things dramatically? I know Rich can because he has a really good voice, of course, but I'm just along for the ride. And I think it's going to be a fun one to be with right now.
I don't know. I have a slightly different view, just with respect to Canada. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing has exposed how vapid and vacuous the recent political ideology in this country has been. And I think that sometimes you get a gift and you don't know where it comes from. And I think that what has been exposed, and you mentioned Quebec and pipelines and stuff, I think it's amazing that everybody sort of is confronted with this reality that Canada is a petro state and the loonie is a petro currency. I think that if it wasn't for Trump, I think we'd be in the wilderness on that perspective. And I think that the idea that Canada is lacking productivity, that has, its GDP per capita is falling. I think that that's something that's been exposed in a way that wouldn't have happened, in a different generation. And I can assure you, having spoken to many of the people on the other side, that they understand that investment for many of the reasons you mentioned, which is to sort of separate ourselves from America, but also for intrinsically good reasons with respect to what we need to do for the next 100 years or 200 years is reinvest in Canada, make things easier, cut taxes, certainly the carbon tax, which just doesn't get enough talk, is not talked about enough. And so, just from a Canadian perspective, I think there's loads of opportunity to sort of turn the ship around. I don't know. I'm an optimist. I'm a little less cynical and much more naive than Keith. It's well documented.
I'm old and weathered. I just think it's going to be a crash and burn first. I think that's where we're headed. And again, the opportunity is there to change. And let's just say the Liberals in Kern, let's say they are reelected. Say that happens. Maybe they've actually. They can identify and acknowledge implicitly that they do need to change. So there's always that hope. And but what do we say about hope as an investment strategy?
It's a terrible investment strategy.
Yeah, it's not a great one.
It's that's a valid point. Maybe we should talk about Mark now. Interesting fella. I mean, there's a lot to be said about a guy like Carney. Not many things, in my view, positive. I'm with you guys on that. People who listen to this show know that. People listen to your show know that. But there's a couple things I want to point to because I think they go under discussed in the mainstream and on podcasts as well. I hear a lot of praise for Mark Carney. This sort of enigma of the financial world. He's been around. He knows his way around. I mean, it's true, right? Like he's
I think you should speak to some hedge fund managers in London before you.
I think. Well, this is why I want to ask, right? Like this is why I want to ask. First of all, I don't trust anybody under 5 foot. I don't trust anybody under 5'6", so I don't trust Mark Carney already. Okay, and two, I'm not convinced that this guy's two, quote unquote crown achievements, his Brexit handling and I think he was the Bank of Canada chair in 2008, right? So did he dealt with both those crises? Do I have that correct? And as far as I know, neither of those really went positively for the countries in which they happened. So do you guys have maybe a view on Carney's past? And then we'll talk about some of the policy positions that he's proposing, including this sort of twisting himself into licorice, talking about the carbon tax, of course.
So let me go first. I'll deal with the Bank of Canada experience. And then, Rich, how about then you jump over into the BOE and everything else afterwards? Sure. That sounds fine. Yeah. So I actually met Carney back in 2011-ish, 12-ish, something around.
Was he taller then, or?
We're on the same height, really.
You are taller than Carney. I've seen you in person.
No, Keith's pretty short.
Give me a break.
He works out though, so he looks bigger than me. Really, that's the deal. But from an objective, like again, I remember the 2008-2009 period incredibly well. I was living it in real time, of course, and so remember, like we just went from this 30-year period. Then rates always going lower. There's never a crisis. Like there's nothing going on. Banks are always rock solid and all that stuff. People don't realize back then, banks literally were on the verge of toppling over. So were insurance companies, pension funds, and all this stuff. And like we were literally minutes away from midnight of that happening. And people would say, well, they had to make policy changes because you can't tolerate that, which I'd always, again, as money managers, it's not our view to say they should do this or they should do that. Instead, it's more, what are they going to do? And back at the time, in their mind, they only had one thing they could do. They have to save the system. And by saving the system, there's no free lunch. Someone had to pay for it. So I met, they what they did, they cut rates to zero and near zero and negative in Europe and in Japan. And then they used quantitative easing and stuff like that. And so when I met Kearney, it was at a function in Halifax, and like in sort of the back room, you get to say hi. Everyone is asking him, you look handsome, nice family, and stuff. And he looks at me, he's like, he's in friendly country. And of course, I can be an asshole sometimes. So I look at him and I say, how do you feel about socializing the bad debt problem? And to which he was, he's like, whoa, I wasn't ready for that one there, kid. And his response to that was, he didn't blink. He said it was necessary, to save the system. And by socializing the bad debt problem, for people that are following that may not really understand what that means, instead of having a select few experience the losses, instead they took those losses and they spread it across the whole economy. And the way it was spread out, government took on debt to bail people out. But the savers, like the most conservative people in the world, they're the ones who ultimately paid. Because instead of getting 4, 5, 6% on their GIC all the time and going to bingo on Saturday nights and having fun, they weren't getting paid anything. They were forced to move the money into high yield debt, emerging market debt, preferred shares. All of a sudden, the conservative investors took on all the risk for everyone. But he readily acknowledged that. And then, chatting with some other pretty big leaders around the world, in Canada and elsewhere, the response was the same, in that Carney, as well as Bernanke at the time, and I forget who was the Brit, Rich, who was leading the Bank of England then? Use a British accent. Use a British accent.
Mervyn King. Mervyn King.
Mervyn? Who was Mervyn King?
Mervyn King.
Whatever. Anyway, they all had to stand up in these meetings, and it gave confidence to business owners, and that's what they did. So Carney was a success with doing that for Canada back then. The policy he chose was the policy that he was told to choose. It wasn't his choice. Because I believe in this whole globalist world, and he was a part of it. He bought it, he sold his soul for it, and that's what they decided to do. And he has not changed his path, ever since. And then he showed up in London, right, Rich? So what happened then?
Well, he took over in July 2013, and this was at this point. You have to understand that the UK didn't have anywhere. There was obviously some banks that may have gone under or whatever, and there was an enormous investment banking liability that was weighing on the UK system, but also that Europe was in a lot of trouble, starting with Greece and etc. The problem with Carney is twofold for me. One is that he kept interest rates in Canada, by the way, and in the UK way too low for way too long, which precipitated the housing bubble. That is not my opinion. That is, well, I guess it's everybody's opinion, but there's a lot of research to support that view. Most crucially, that research comes from the Bank of England, which challenged his view. So Carney said that it was relative housing scarcity that caused the housing bubble in the UK, and the Bank of England's research, and they've done a lot of it, said, and I quote, the relative scarcity of housing played almost no role in the national housing price level since 2000. Basically, what they said was that it was financial engineering that caused the massive housing bubble. Let me know if you've heard that before. And so, he's obviously taken zero responsibility for that. And I think that it's something that I find rather unforgivable, having watched him for as many years as I did set interest rates. I worked in England from 2011 to 2020. I can assure you that my colleagues and many, many people who I worked with and ran and bumped into also agree. the only way that you get housing prices to rip as high as they did is if you have negative real interest rates and you sustain those for a long time. So that's the first thing. Second thing, his involvement in Brexit to me is also unforgivable. Remember, the Bank of England is a technocrat. It is meant to be apolitical, and he should have never, ever, ever voiced an opinion, regardless of what he thought. And he did, and I think that was a huge mistake, just from me judging somebody else's work. Maybe that's not fair. Maybe that is fair. And then finally, the last piece, I think, if Canada is a petro state, is our largest export. If we basically sell oil to pay for imported goods to the tune of nearly 4.6% of GDP, which is a massive, massive number. His, in my view, outrageous lie that, putting a carbon tax on industry would not be paid for by governments and or consumers is something that I think he does not believe, and that terrifies me. I think that he is let's just say his views on energy and climate policy, I think, are really deeply held. And for Canadians, I would be very, very wary of that. And maybe that's too sharp a call. Maybe that's too sharp. I might get in trouble with Keith for saying being so crystal clear in my views. But I think, this idea that he's going to scrap the carbon tax is a classic bait and switch. And I think we should be very, very wary of that.
I think you're probably right. I just want to point out that of the three of us on this call, only Keith is also a WEF man. He's been to an event with Mark Carney. Rich, have you ever been to an event with Mark Carney?
No, I've never.
Me neither.
Been,
That's so weird. That is weird. What were they serving, Keith? Bug burgers or what? What they have on the menu?
Eat see bugs. I got some great stories. One of my really close friends, I can't say his name. He told me not to share his name, but I'll share the story anyway. And it goes something like this. I wake up in the morning and he's like, I have this chat group going on with another good friend. He said, guys, last night I was at a dinner party with, I think it was Salvini. Was he the prime minister of Italy at one point?
Salvini? Yeah. Sure. Well, there's Berlusconi and then...
Not Berlusconi. No, it was Salvini.
I think he had a moment in the sun. They all
did. Like that. And he's like, yeah, a dinner party. I'm like, so you had dinner with the prime minister or president of Italy? He said, oh yeah, it was a good night. And he said, but the morning was even better. I was going to grab my coffee and I bumped into the Pope.
I love it.
So the world is great. You make friends and you swim around in different networks, and people bump into things and stuff. Like I remember when COVID was, it wasn't quite snowballing yet, but it was almost there. And this other group of friends I have, a bunch of European-based, Middle East-based managers. It's a WhatsApp group, and they send out a note like on Sunday, my Sunday morning, and they're like, "Guys, hop on now." We're like, "What's going on?" And this guy was based in Milan, he said, "Guys, they're closing northern Italy." And we're like, "What are you talking about?" And he walked through. He said, "Like people are literally sprinting to the train stations with their suitcases, to get out of Italy." And he said, "Well, where are they going?" "Where they're going to France." And it's, "What happens in France?" "Well, they get locked down there." And like lockdowns weren't a part of the game yet. But I remember then on Monday morning, and the first thing that we did, Rich wasn't with us then, but we started selling equities. We reduced risk substantially. My point is, make some nice friends like Joey and Rich, and then you get ahead of the curve here. Because I think we're headed into these kind of events again. And there's going to be some significant country or government out there are going to wake up some morning, and the PM, the prime minister or the president or whoever is going to get a phone call from Treasury to say, we got a problem. And that's how it's going to go down. And I don't think we can get out of it. I really don't.
Well, I know Keith is tight for time. Let's wrap here. I want to ask one sort of final question. You guys can both offer a comment and then we'll part ways. You're talking about reducing risk. You're talking to an audience here that is maybe in what a year ago or 2 years ago was probably the riskiest asset in terms of legislative risk and all these other things. Is still very volatile, but this is a crowd that is pro risk and young. I think, it skews young compared to, I don't know, let's say the bond heads, right? You point to yourself. I'm not pointing to you. But what is the average sort of, under 35, under 40 Canadian supposed to do to reduce risk? These are people who are working jobs, 9 to 5s in a lot of cases, don't have huge investment portfolios because they maybe can't afford it, maybe don't have the bandwidth to handle it. What is the method through which these people can reduce risk? That's a big question that I think about a lot. Like, I know what I would do to take risk off, but there's people who are just like on the knife's edge all the time. And so what can they do to reduce risk? Is that even a fair question for you guys? I don't know, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Well, truthfully, it's not a fair question for us because Rich and I are both regulated. So there are things we can and cannot say on an open call,
right?
Like this. Everyone's appetite for risk is completely different. But and this is now just my view here. But one thing to think about, the moment that we do experience a risk-off event or moment, the irony is that usually some of the most liquid markets actually sell off. So whether it's crypto, but gold especially, so you can have an event that would be like the dream event for people who are investing in bullion, and all of a sudden gold is selling off, and they don't understand why. But the answer to the why is because everyone needs liquidity at certain points in time, and that's when you will have so for example, the people using the old school example, and people are buying junior miners all the time, for example, and then they also hold the seniors and bullion. And all of a sudden something bad happens, and the junior mining stocks they're holding, there's no liquidity. Like, there is zero bid on it. So for them to raise liquidity, they have to sell the liquid stuff that's going on. So I do apologize to everyone that we for regulatory reasons we can't tell everyone's listening you should own this or that, but you do want to consider that different markets can react or behave differently than what you're expecting. So for us, we're conservative managers. That's who we are. We do an incredibly successful job at protecting capital on the downside, and there are ways we do that because we're never all into one market. How about you, Rich? What do you think on that side as well?
Yeah, I just think so. The only thing I can say, again, talking around it so we don't get in trouble, is to not be convinced by the promise of diversification, is what I would say. So there are lots and lots of people who will say, oh, well, if you own this and you own that, you're really diversified. And what I would submit to you is that in a crisis, or even not even necessarily a crisis, just in let's say a significant drawdown, many of the assets or indices or whatever that you thought were, let's say, uncorrelated, they become very much correlated. Well, that is to say, your correlation will go to 1, right? So correlation is, that's a statistical, word that is to describe the co-movement of particular index or two prices within a specific time.
What's the formula for that, Rich?
And anyways, it could be -1, which is to say that it's not correlated at all, and then 1, which is to say very, very correlated. And so when times are good, people will sell you on the idea that some assets are completely uncorrelated. But the truth is, in part because of the liquidity, but there are other reasons.
So that wasn't the answer Joey was looking for.
I know.
I don't. It doesn't matter. It turns out it actually doesn't matter what you say because the whole chat's just talking about being all in on Bitcoin. So it doesn't matter what you say anyway. No one gives a shit. So listen.
One thing that's important for people to realize, and they're on social media these days and stuff. So like people like us, we are regulated and licensed. So people have to appreciate what we're allowed to say and not allowed to say. That it is what it is, and some people don't understand that. So they'll take a shot at Rich, and they just they don't know where they're coming from. Do you know what I mean?
They ought not to.
And then you also have a lot of people on social media platforms and stuff who are everyone is selling something. They're selling newsletters and things like that, and you're like. I always ask, follow the money. Where's the money coming from? Where's it going? And things. But one thing that's great today, though, like for this platform and all the other ones out there, because we run a platform as well, we're there. There's so much enthusiasm out there today for people who understand the world is not the same as it used to be. And those people are, the monkeys that we did earlier, and they all think Carney is awesome. But instead, there's increasingly more and more people that are engaged with the world. And they know things are a bit different, and so they're asking questions. They're swimming around. They're trying to find. The band Blind Melon? Do you guys know that band?
Yeah, I like them.
Yeah,
remember
I
that?
know the band. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
they
One
had
Hit Wonder or something. I
Yeah,
think,
no,
right?
it was like No Rain. That's what it
Yeah,
was.
that's it.
You think about the video for No Rain. It's this little young lady. She's dressed in a bumblebee outfit, and she's walking around, and she's the only kid dressed with the bumblebee outfit, and she just doesn't fit in with anyone. And all of a sudden she goes out for a walk, and she goes over this little hill, and everyone else is dressed in a bumblebee outfit. And that's, I'm trying to say that, everyone today listening to this and Looney Hour and everything else, we're all bumblebees. We're all trying to find each other and to figure it out.
If you ever have a wealth management meeting with Keith, all you have to do is request that he shows up in his bumblebee outfit, and he will do it. No questions asked. Okay, so I mean, we'll sign off. I mean, you guys both do the Looney Hour podcast. There's people in the chat talking about how great Rich's ice cap market review videos are. I think they're great too. I wish they were a little longer. That's my own personal preference. I like something more than 8 minutes, but that's okay. I think they're still very strong. I'll give it to you guys to sign off. I just want to note that, Keith, you, I think, are now officially Rich's reporting superior. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
So on his performance review, I met Rich in the summer, okay? And I got to tell you, first of all, this is the kind of guy who meets you at a pub and is reading at a table when you get there. Worst vibe, but that's a separate story.
True story.
When you see Rich, people don't realize this because the Looney Hour is not like a full camera setup. Rich should be able to bench 225 at his size, and I'm not sure that he can.
I hit 225. I love 225.
It. Thank God, man, because it needs to be in your performance review. If not, it's unacceptable.
My personal trainer will attest to it. I'll get him to write a note.
So one thing I love about Rich, and Rich, I don't need to say this on air, but Rich knows this. I have an incredible amount of love for Rich and his family. I really do. But there, a few months back, I forget where we were, which city we're in. We're meeting somewhere to do stuff. We're at like a real fancy hotel, and I said, let's just meet at the bar down there. We'll do our stuff. And the bartender comes over and said, well, you have. And both of us just looked at him and said, we'll have bubbles. And it was like, it's at like 2 p.m, right? We weren't going for like a pint or anything. And then I think Rich had Prosecco, and I said, I'll have Cava, and we do this. And we're like, yeah, we sorted it out. And then we go for a beer afterwards, and then it's wine and things. But yeah, I have a lot of love for Rich, and everyone who's following here right now for the first time, check out this guy because he's going to make your life better. He really will.
Thanks, Keith.
It's true. It's true. You guys do a good job. And, as someone who does a podcast smaller than yours, admittedly, but sometimes it's hard when you're first starting out with an audience to say things that you think, because you don't want the negative feedback. You don't want people to tell you you're wrong. You don't want people to criticize you, but that's how you get sharper. And when I listen to you guys, and Steve Soretsky's on this level too, especially on the real estate side,
great.
This is a sharp trio. And you don't get to that size. You don't get to that level of longevity. You guys are, I think, on year 3 now. You don't get to that level of longevity without being right a lot more than you are wrong. And so, kudos to you guys. Now, please tell people all about where they can find both of you, whether it's Ice Cap, the Looney Hour. The floor is all yours.
Yeah, I'll go first. So, Rich and I, we both work for Ice Cap Asset Management.com. You can go there to find us. But we manage money for families across the country. And Rich and I, we also both we're co-host of the Looney Hour podcast, which is a Canadian-centric podcast. Talk about a lot of the same things that you're talking about here as well. And we have so much enthusiasm for what's happening. It's just running through our veins, and it's fun. Do you have to add anything to that, Rich, as well?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the Ice Cap Canadian market wrap, which you said is too short. I'll say too bad. It's because they're original every week, which. So it was, I quite gets Keith knows. I call Keith like, oh, what are we gonna do this week? I got really stressed out, and for me, maybe the problem is my standard is very, 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 very high. For me, it shows, everyone Rich. Is life. Everyone is life and death for me. I really, really care about getting things right, and you can check that out on YouTube. It's the Ice Cap Canadian Market Wrap. Give me a subscribe and a follow. I think that's what But
the great thing about like this conversation and the Loonie Hour as well, like it's long form conversation. And nothing's rehearsed, so like who knows, like what stupid thing we're going to say. But the great thing about Rich's podcast, the Ice Cap Canadian Market Wrap, it's like bang bang. It's like 5 to 8 minutes long. It's telling you exactly what you need to know, what's happening in Rich's style with a lot of data and analytics. And I know for a fact a lot of people on Bay Street and even down on Wall Street as well, they go to this thing. They want to know, okay, cool, I got it. So it's an incredible destination. It's new for Canada.
It's very strong. So people listening to the show, Loonie Hour, Ice Cap Market Wrap. This is the kind of content. If you like this show, you'll like that show. There's no doubt in my mind. Even though the only Bitcoin talk is Keith, slandering it, but that's fine. We'll talk about that another time. Thank you both for your time tonight. Thank you, listeners and viewers. We'll see you potentially tomorrow if the snow holds off, and if not, then Monday. Adios.